Convenient timing, don't you think? Diane said, loud enough for the entire table at the rehearsal dinner to hear, her wine glass still raised from the toast a few minutes earlier. I set down my own glass and looked at her for a long moment, the numbness that had been living in my left hand for 4 months, suddenly feeling very present. Then I reached into my bag, pulled out a folded envelope I'd been carrying to every family gathering since March, and slid it across the table toward her. My name is Simone Ferreira. I'm 31, and this is the story of the night before my wedding, when I finally stopped explaining myself to a woman who had already decided I was lying. It started in February, 4 months before the wedding, with something small enough that I almost didn't mention it. My left hand went numb one morning while I was making coffee, a strange tingling that spread from my fingers to my wrist and lingered for most of the day. I told my fiancé Adrian about it that evening, mostly in passing, the way you mention something odd rather than something alarming. By March, the numbness had returned twice more, and I'd started noticing something else, a blurring in my right eye that came and went, sometimes lasting an hour, sometimes most of a day. I made an appointment with my primary care doctor, who referred me to a neurologist after listening to the pattern of symptoms with an expression I didn't like. The neurologist, a careful, thorough woman named Dr. Alvarez, ordered an MRI in April. I sat in the waiting room afterward, scrolling my phone without reading anything on it, until she called me into her office and showed me the scan, several small white lesions scattered across my brain and spinal cord, the kind of pattern that doesn't appear by accident. Based on this imaging and your symptom history, she told me, I'm confident this is multiple sclerosis. We'll need additional testing to confirm the subtype, but I don't want to wait to start discussing treatment options. I drove home that afternoon in a kind of controlled shock. The wedding invitations already printed, the venue already booked, a diagnosis now sitting in the middle of a life I'd been planning in a completely different direction. Adrian met me at my apartment that evening, and I told him everything: the numbness, the blurred vision, the MRI, the word multiple sclerosis sitting between us on the kitchen table like something neither of us knew how to pick up yet. He was good about it that night, better than I expected, holding my hand and asking careful questions and telling me it didn't change how he felt about marrying me. What I didn't anticipate was how his family would respond once he told them. Diane, his mother, took the news in a way that confused me before it eventually made sense. Her first reaction wasn't concern, it was a kind of skeptical pause, a beat too long before she said anything at all. A few days later, Adrian mentioned, almost apologetically, that his mother had asked him whether it was possible I was under a lot of stress, and whether stress could cause symptoms like that on its own. I let that comment go the first time. People process frightening news in strange ways, and I told myself she was struggling to understand a diagnosis she didn't have context for. But the comments didn't stop. Over the following weeks, Adrian relayed several more, each one slightly worse than the last. Diane had told his sister that it seemed strange the symptoms had started right as wedding planning ramped up. She'd mentioned to a family friend that some people manufacture health issues when they feel overwhelmed by big life events. She'd asked Adrian directly, more than once, whether he'd actually seen the MRI himself, or whether he was simply taking my word for it. I offered, early on, to show her the imaging myself, or to have Dr. Alvarez speak with her directly if that would help. Adrian raised it with her once. She declined, telling him it wasn't necessary and that she trusted her own judgment about people. I understood, slowly and with a kind of quiet dread, that this wasn't actually about evidence. She had decided something about me before the diagnosis existed, and the diagnosis had simply become the newest thing to fold into that existing belief. Adrian's father, Marcus, mostly stayed out of it, the way he stayed out of most things involving his wife's opinions, though he did tell me once, quietly in the kitchen while Diane was in another room, that he didn't share her doubts and thought she needed to let it go. I appreciated that he said it, even if he never said it to her directly. There was one dinner in late May, at Diane and Marcus's house, where the tension came closest to the surface before the rehearsal dinner itself. I'd had an infusion 2 days earlier and was still feeling the fatigue that usually followed, quieter than usual, moving a little slower than usual around the kitchen while I helped clear plates. Diane watched me for a moment and asked in a tone that sounded almost casual whether I always got extra tired right before family events. I told her, as evenly as I could manage, that the fatigue was a documented side effect of my treatment, not something tied to any particular occasion. She nodded slowly, the way you nod at something you've already decided not to believe, and changed the subject to the seating chart. By May, I'd started treatment, a disease-modifying therapy that required regular infusions and left me exhausted for a day or two afterward. I scheduled those infusions carefully around wedding planning, telling almost nobody outside Adrian and my own parents, partly because I was still adjusting to the diagnosis myself, and partly because I didn't want to give Diane more material to work with. I started carrying a folder with me to family gatherings sometime in early June, almost as a form of quiet self-protection. Inside it was a printed summary from Dr. Alvarez, the MRI findings, the diagnostic criteria she'd used, a clear clinical explanation of why this was not a condition that could be manufactured or exaggerated for effect. I never planned to use it dramatically. I mostly just wanted it nearby, in case a moment came where I needed something more solid than my own exhausted insistence that I wasn't lying. That moment arrived at the rehearsal dinner, the night before the wedding, at a long table set with candles and centerpieces I'd spent months choosing, surrounded by both families and a handful of close friends. Diane had been drinking steadily through the appetizers, and by the time the toasts wrapped up, she had the particular loose confidence of someone who no longer felt like filtering herself. "Convenient timing, don't you think?" she said, raising her glass slightly, looking directly at me. "All these symptoms, right when the wedding got serious. I've seen this before. People get cold feet, and suddenly there's a health crisis that makes everyone rally around them instead of asking harder questions." The table went quiet in the particular way tables go quiet when someone says out loud what they've only been implying for months. Adrian's face went pale beside me. My own mother, sitting across the table, set down her fork with more force than necessary. I didn't raise my voice. I'd had 4 months to imagine this exact moment, though I'd never been sure it would actually happen at the rehearsal dinner itself. "Diane, I understand this has been hard for you to accept," I said, "but I'm not asking you to take my word for it anymore." I reached into my bag, pulled out the folded envelope and slid it across the table toward her. "That's a summary from my neurologist. The MRI results, the diagnostic criteria, an explanation of what multiple sclerosis actually looks like on imaging, which is not something a person can fabricate by being stressed about a wedding. I've been carrying it with me for weeks, honestly hoping I'd never have to hand it to you like this." Diane looked at the envelope for a long moment without touching it. Her expression caught somewhere between defiance and the first flicker of doubt. "This doesn't prove anything," she said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "It proves the diagnosis," I said, "which is really all I ever needed it to prove. I'm not asking you to like me, Diane. I'm asking you to stop telling people I'm faking a neurological condition because the timing was inconvenient for the story you wanted to tell about our marriage." Marcus, sitting beside her, reached over and picked up the envelope himself, opening it and reading the first page in silence while the table waited. When he looked up, his expression had shifted into something firmer than I'd seen from him before. "Diane," he said quietly, "this is a real diagnosis. Lesions on an MRI aren't something anyone stages. I told you this months ago, and I'm telling you again in front of everyone, because apparently that's what it's taken." Diane didn't respond right away. She picked up the papers herself, scanning them the way people do when they're looking for a reason to keep believing what they already believe, and finding, gradually, that the reason wasn't there. "I just don't understand why nobody told me sooner," she finally said, which wasn't quite an apology, but was the closest thing to one she'd offered in 4 months. "I offered to have my neurologist speak with you directly in March," I said. "You declined. I offered to show you the imaging myself. You said it wasn't necessary. I've been telling the truth this entire time, Diane. You just weren't interested in hearing it until it was in a format you couldn't argue with." Adrian finally spoke, his hand finding mine under the table. "Mom, I need you to actually hear this. Simone has spent the last 4 months getting infusions and dealing with symptoms that scare her, on top of planning a wedding, while you've been telling people she's making it up. That's not okay. It was never okay." The rest of the dinner was quieter than planned, though not entirely tense. Diane read through the full packet twice, asked a few genuine questions toward the end, about treatment, about prognosis, about what the coming years might actually look like, questions that sounded less like interrogation and more like someone finally trying to understand something she'd spent months refusing to. The wedding the next day went smoothly, better than I expected given the night before. Diane didn't make a speech, having not been asked to give 1 month earlier when the seating and toast list were finalized, a decision that had felt slightly harsh at the time and felt entirely fair by that point. She sat quietly through the ceremony, and at the reception she found me during a lull in the dancing and said, simply, that she was sorry it had taken an envelope of medical paperwork to believe her own daughter-in-law. I told her I appreciated her saying that, and that I hoped we could move forward from it, though I also told her plainly that I intended to keep advocating for myself the same way going forward, regardless of who found it inconvenient. In the months since, Diane has in her own limited way tried. She's asked about my treatment schedule a handful of times, remembered to ask how I was feeling after infusions, stopped repeating the story about convenient timing to anyone who would listen. It isn't a complete transformation, and I don't think it ever fully will be, but it's honest progress, the kind built on someone actually reading the evidence instead of dismissing it. At Thanksgiving that first year, she pulled me aside in the kitchen while the turkey rested and asked, quietly, if it would be all right for her to come to one of my infusion appointments sometime, just to understand the process better. I told her she was welcome to, and she came the following month, sitting in the chair beside mine for 2 hours, asking the nurse a handful of careful questions, watching the whole process with an expression I hadn't seen from her before, something closer to genuine attention than performance. It didn't erase 4 months of doubt, but it was a start, and I'd learned by then not to dismiss a start just because it arrived later than it should have. Dr. Alvarez, when I told her the story at a follow-up appointment months later, said something that stuck with me. People believe what's convenient for them until the inconvenience of the truth becomes impossible to avoid, she said. You gave her exactly that. It's not your job to make people believe you sooner than they're willing to. It's just your job to keep telling the truth until they run out of reasons not to. I still carry a folder to family gatherings sometimes, though these days it's mostly out of habit rather than necessity. Adrian and I have been married a 1.5 years now. The disease has stayed relatively stable with treatment, and I've learned to live inside a diagnosis that used to feel like the end of a plan and now feels like simply one more fact about my life, alongside my job and my marriage and the small, ordinary details of a future I'm still building. I think about that rehearsal dinner sometimes, the candles, the centerpieces, the particular silence that fell over the table when I finally stopped absorbing a comment and handed someone proof instead. I didn't do it out of anger, not exactly. I did it because I was tired of being disbelieved about my own body by someone who had never once asked a real question before deciding she already knew the answer. Some truths don't need to be argued. They just need to be handed over, quietly, and given the chance to speak for themselves.